Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're here, you might be winding down for the day. Perhaps you're tucked under the covers, a warm drink by your side, looking for a quiet story to carry you into a peaceful night's rest. Tonight, I want to take you back in time, more than 1,000 years into the past, to the rugged lands of the far north, where snow blanketed the hills, icy winds howled through the fjords, and the nights stretched long into darkness. You may know them as warriors, explorers, seafarers. But tonight, we're not here to talk about battles or conquests or dragons on longships. Tonight, we're going to explore something much more intimate and much more human. How did the Vikings survive the coldest nights of the year? Imagine living in a wooden longhouse on the edge of the Norwegian wilderness. Outside, snowdrifts pile high against the door. The north wind moans like a spirit through the pines. And the sun, having vanished hours ago, won't rise again until mid-morning. The year is 875 AD. There is no electricity, no central heating, no modern fabrics or synthetic insulation, no freezers to store your food, no matches to light your fire. And yet, the Vikings survived. Not only did they survive, they thrived. They carved a life out of some of the harshest climates in the known world. Tonight, we'll walk through their world together, slowly, gently, piece by piece. We'll learn how they built their homes to trap warmth and resist the bitter winds. We'll see how their clothes, crafted from wool, fur, and leather, allowed them to sleep through the cold without freezing. We'll peek into their nightly routines, their fires, their meals, their quiet rituals, those silent, shared acts that kept them alive through the endless dark. Oh, and if you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a like or subscribe. Super curious where you're all listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is. There always blows my mind how people are falling asleep to this all over the world. So lie back, take a deep breath, and let's begin our journey into the frozen heart of the Viking world. Close your eyes for a moment and picture the Viking world. Imagine the jagged coastlines of Norway, the windswept plains of Denmark, and the icy volcanic landscapes of Iceland. These were not gentle lands. They were carved by glaciers, hammered by wind, and shaped by the relentless force of nature. The Viking Age, roughly spanning from the late 8th century to the early 11th century, saw Norsemen living in regions where winter wasn't just a season. It was a dominating presence, stretching across many months of the year. In places like northern Norway, the sun would disappear entirely during the winter solstice. For days, even weeks, the sky remained dim and blue-gray, lit only by the faint shimmer of the stars or the dancing glow of the aurora borealis. Snow was not an occasional visitor. It was a constant companion. Deep drifts often blocked paths. Frozen rivers and lakes became travel routes for sleds and skis. The temperature could fall well below freezing and stay there for months. And yet, despite this, Viking settlements dotted the shores, valleys, and even the inland mountains. Why? Because the sea, despite its cold, provided life. Fish, trade, mobility, and because they knew how to adapt. In Iceland, for example, settlers learned to live alongside lava fields and geysers. Hot springs were sometimes used for bathing, and geothermal energy, though not harnessed the way we do today, offered small but important comforts. In Sweden, the forests were thick and dark, filled with both danger and sustenance, timber for building, game for hunting, and herbs for medicine. But make no mistake, this environment was unforgiving. A poorly prepared winter could mean death, a failed harvest, a fire that went out in the night, a leak in the roof that let in the cold. These were not inconveniences, they were mortal threats. And so, the Vikings became masters of preparation, of resourcefulness, and of resilience. To survive the longest nights, they had to understand their land better than we understand ours today. They didn't just live on it. They lived with it. They followed the migration of animals, the shift of the seasons, and the patterns of the stars. They studied the skies. They listened to the wind. They watched the way snow fell and melted. They turned nature, even at its harshest, into a silent partner in survival. The wind howls outside. Snow swirls like powder across the fields, carried by invisible currents. The sky is a pale, indifferent gray. But now, let us step through a creaking wooden door. It closes behind us with a heavy thud. And suddenly, we're inside the warmth of a Viking longhouse. The first thing you notice is the smell. Earth, smoke, wood, a hint of livestock, and the lingering scent of cooked meat, boiled lamb perhaps, or dried fish warmed in the hearth. The light is dim. There are no windows, not really. Small slits in the walls let in a little daylight during the shorter days. But at night, the longhouse is lit by the soft orange flicker of fire, burning steadily at the center of the room. The hearth, or open fire pit, runs along the middle of the building. It is not just for cooking. It is the beating heart of the longhouse, the source of heat, light, and life itself. The walls are made of timber logs or planks, depending on the region and available resources. In Iceland and some coastal parts of Norway, turf walls are also used, thick and insulating, cut from the earth and stacked like heavy bricks. These earthen walls keep out the worst of the cold and help to trap warmth inside. The roof? It's steep and sloped to shed snow, made of overlapping planks or thatch, sometimes even covered in sod. A smoke hole at the peak allows the rising smoke to escape, though not all of it. A haze often lingers in the rafters, warming the upper beams. The interior is long and narrow. Think of a ship turned upside down. On either side of the central fire are raised platforms, wooden benches covered in straw, animal skins, and wool blankets. These are beds by night and seats by day. Families sleep together here, close to the fire. The closer you are to the center, the warmer you stay. Children might sleep curled next to their parents. The elderly are given spots of honor, near the hearth where the heat is strongest. Dogs might curl at their feet. Chickens sometimes roost in corners. And above, in the darkened rafters, herbs hang drying. Tools rest on beams. Meat hangs cured by the smoke. Every inch of the space is used with purpose. There are no rooms in the modern sense. The longhouse is a shared world, a communal shelter. Privacy is rare and silence even rarer. Though on the coldest nights, the house grows still. Only the crackle of the fire, the snore of the sleepers, and the occasional groan of timber in the wind break the hush. And this longhouse isn't just a house. It is a microcosm. A small world where everything needed to survive the winter is stored, protected, and preserved. Food is kept in sealed barrels. Dried fish, smoked meats, grains, and fermented milk. Clothing and bedding are layered and thick, stored in chests or hung on hooks. Weapons rest nearby, just in case of wolves. Or worse. The Viking longhouse was more than shelter. It was a fortress against the cold, against hunger, against the long reach of night. And to build such a home took more than skill. It took planning, cooperation, and ancestral knowledge passed down across generations. But even the warmest home must be paired with the right protection on the body. So next, we'll explore what the Vikings wore to keep warm when even the fires weren't enough. Let us leave the longhouse just for a moment. You pull open the wooden door, and a cold wind rushes in like a wave. You step outside, and the breath in your lungs turns to mist. This is the kind of cold that bites at fingers and cheeks. That makes your eyes water. That makes every breath feel sharp and heavy. And this is the world the Vikings dressed for. When we think of Viking clothing, we often imagine warriors in metal helmets with shields and swords gleaming. But that was just a fraction of their lives. In reality, for most of the year, and especially in winter, clothing was survival. not decoration, not status, not fashion. Let's dress a Viking now, piece by piece, layer by layer. The base layer, linen and wool against the skin. The first layer was often a linen undertunic, sometimes made from flax fibers. Linen was light and breathable, ideal for warmer seasons, but in winter, it provided a smooth base beneath thicker garments. But linen alone would never suffice. Over that came a woolen tunic, the most common and practical garment in the Viking world. Wool, spun and woven from the fleece of hardy northern sheep, was the miracle fabric of the Viking Age. It repelled water, trapped heat, and could remain warm even when damp. These wool tunics varied in thickness, depending on the purpose. Everyday workers might wear simple gray or brown versions. Wealthier Norsemen could afford more dyed or decorated variants, deep reds, dark blues, or greens, colored with natural plant dyes. The tunic reached the knees and often had long sleeves, sometimes tightly fitted to preserve body heat. The cuffs could be tied or bound with leather straps to keep out wind. Trousers and leg wraps. On the legs, Vikings wore trousers, made from wool too, or occasionally rougher linens for layering. To protect the lower legs, they used leg wraps or weiningas, long bands of wool wound tightly from ankle to knee. These acted as insulation, like modern leg warmers, and also helped secure the trousers and prevent snow from slipping inside. Think of them as a combination of socks, gaiters, and thermal wraps all in one. Cloaks and mantles. Shields against the wind now for the outer layer. The cloak. Thick, heavy, and often pinned with a brooch at one shoulder, the Viking cloak was a true barrier against the wind. Most cloaks were made of tightly woven wool, but for those with access, or the wealth to trade, fur-lined cloaks were prized above all. Wolf, fox, bear, reindeer. Fur was the ultimate luxury and the ultimate protection. A fur-lined hood, in particular, could make all the difference on a frigid night journey or a snowstorm in the mountains. Vikings wrapped themselves tight, using layers the way we use thermal jackets and downcoats today. And they adjusted their outfits by season, by task, and by region. Hands, feet, and heads, covering the extremities. The Vikings knew that heat escapes fastest from the head, hands, and feet, so these areas received special care. Woolen caps or hats were worn frequently, simple in design, often cone-shaped or rounded. In truly bitter weather, furs were worn around the face, and beards offered extra warmth to the chin and neck. Mittens, made from leather or layered wool, were common for working outdoors. Sometimes they were lined with fleece for added insulation. And on the feet, woolen socks, thick and hand-stitched, layered into leather boots, carefully oiled or waxed to repel snow. Some boots were lined with fur or straw. Others had extra wraps of wool inside. There were even primitive snowshoes, made from bent wood and sinew, for travel across deep snowdrifts in the northern lands. Children, elders, and class differences. Children wore much the same as adults, scaled-down versions of the same layers, though they were often swaddled more tightly, especially at night. The elderly, more vulnerable to the cold, were given priority by the hearth. Their clothing, too, was thicker, often layered with soft furs and lined wool. Wealth played a role, of course. A rich jarl might wear imported silk trim or fur from exotic animals like lynx or sable. But a simple farmer wore what his family could make. Rough wool, perhaps hand-woven by his wife or mother, dyed with local herbs, and stitched with strong, practiced fingers. And always, practicality came first. Every piece of clothing was sewn, patched, and repurposed as needed. Scarcity demanded it. Nothing went to waste. Even dressed like this, though, even wrapped in wool and fur and leather, the cold still seeped in eventually. And so the Vikings had to keep moving, working, feeding fires, and, above all, eating well. Because the fire within, the food in the belly, was just as vital as the cloak on the back, the fire crackles softly in the heart of the longhouse. Outside, the world is frozen. The snow is thick. The fields are silent. Nothing grows. The rivers are still. But inside, someone is stirring a pot. A heavy iron cauldron hangs above the hearth. Inside, something steams gently. A mixture of root vegetables, perhaps, with dried herbs, bits of salted meat, and thick broth boiled from bones. This is more than dinner. It is survival in a bowl. Eating to endure the cold. For the Vikings, winter wasn't a time to indulge. It was a time to ration, to stretch every scrap, to plan meals weeks or even months in advance. There were no supermarkets, no shipments from distant lands. Every bite eaten in February had to be grown, hunted, preserved, or stored during the warmer months. That meant Viking diets were high in fat, dense in calories, and carefully prepared to maximize warmth and energy. Let's break it down. Meat, preserved, smoked, salted meat, was a staple when available, but fresh meat was rare in deep winter. Instead, the Vikings relied on preservation. In autumn, before the first snows, animals were slaughtered. This was often a practical choice. Better to kill some livestock than try to feed them all through the winter. The meat was then salted heavily and stored in barrels, smoked slowly over weeks, using hardwoods to infuse flavor and preserve texture, dried into jerky-like strips, perfect for chewing during travel, boiled into broth with bones simmered for hours to release every nutrient. Common meats included pork, lamb, goat, and beef, depending on the region. In coastal areas, fish was far more common, especially cod, herring, and salmon. Fish was often dried on racks or fermented, creating pungent, long-lasting protein that could last all season. Dairy, fermented and stored dairy, was another pillar of winter survival. During summer, cows and goats were milked daily. That milk was quickly transformed, not wasted, into cheese, butter, and fermented milk, similar to today's yogurt or kefir. These products were stored in cool, dry cellars or buried in snow-lined pits to last through the colder months. Thick goat's cheese, rich and salty, might be sliced into soup. Butter could be spread on barley bread or used to coat roasted root vegetables. And fermented milk drinks provided vital probiotics and easy calories for families of all ages. Grains. Barley, rye, and oats. Vikings grew hardy grains that could withstand short growing seasons, primarily barley, rye, and oats. Wheat was rare and expensive, usually imported and reserved for nobles. With these grains they made flatbreads, cooked on hot stones near the fire. Porridge, often mixed with berries or scraps of dried meat. Ale, brewed in large vats and stored in wooden casks for winter cheer. Grain was stored in sealed bins, protected from dampness and rodents, sometimes buried underground to keep it cold and dry. In the morning, warm porridge. In the evening, flatbread soaked in broth or layered with smoked fish. Every grain mattered, vegetables and roots. The earth's winter gifts. Though the land froze in winter, the Vikings prepared early, harvesting and storing cabbage, turnips, onions, leeks, carrots, parsnips, garlic. These vegetables were often stored in root cellars or buried in straw-lined pits dug deep into the earth. They could be boiled into thick soups, roasted on iron pans, or preserved in vinegar. Even humble dishes like boiled turnips with salted pork became feasts on cold nights. Berries, nuts, and forest finds. During summer, Vikings foraged for wild berries, nuts, and mushrooms. Berries like lingonberries and bilberries were dried or turned into thick preserves. Mushrooms were strung and smoked near the ceiling beams. Hazelnuts were stored in sacks and eaten sparingly. Honey, rare and precious, was sometimes used in both cooking and mead. Even in the coldest months, the forest provided, if you knew how to store its gifts. Drinks, mead, ale, and herbal infusions. In winter, water often froze, but inside the longhouse, drinks were still shared. Mead, fermented honey drink, was saved for celebrations and rituals. Ale was more common, made from barley, often cloudy and rich herbal teas from dried mint, nettle, or wild chamomile were sometimes steeped for comfort and warmth. Drinking was not just nourishment, it was ritual, celebration, and connection. Meals as moments of warmth and bonding meals were rarely rushed. At the end of a long day, families would gather around the fire. Elders told stories. Children shared laughter. Bowls were passed hand to hand. Bread was broken. Spoons clinked. Eating wasn't just survival. It was community. It was ritual. And in the deep, dark night, it was hope. Close your eyes again. It's the middle of winter. Midnight. The wind whistles across the roof. Snow hisses softly against the walls. The sky outside is black as ink. No moon, no stars, only the breath of the earth, cold and ancient. But inside the longhouse, a glow remains. The hearth is still alive. Its light flickers against the timber beams. Shadows dance along the walls. Embers shift, glowing like the last coals of the sun. And though many sleep, someone is always keeping watch, because if the fire dies, the night wins. Fire was life for the Vikings. Fire wasn't just warmth, it was life itself. Without it, food couldn't be cooked, metal couldn't be shaped, darkness couldn't be held back. In the depth of winter, fire was the line between survival and death. It gave heat, light, and protection, not only from cold, but from spirits and beasts believed to lurk in the dark. So, how did they keep it burning? Let's step closer to the hearth and find out. Fuel. What did they burn? In the Viking world, especially in the north, wood was precious. The ideal firewood was birch, easy to split, burns clean ash, dense and long-burning pine, available in abundance, though smoky juniper, fragrant and ideal for cooking small meals. Before winter, entire families prepared stacks of firewood, chopped, dried, and stored under overhangs or lean-tos. But wood wasn't the only fuel. In Iceland, where trees were scarce, they used peat, decomposed plant matter, cut from bogs in thick blocks, then dried. Peat didn't burn as hot as wood, but it burned slowly and steadily, perfect for overnight fires. They also used dried animal dung, especially from cattle brushwood, and bark for kindling charcoal, for specialized heating or smithing. Even children had roles, gathering twigs, watching the smoke, fetching dry moss to start morning flames. Starting a fire, no matches, no lighters. Lighting a fire was a skill, not a guarantee. Vikings used flint and steel to strike sparks, tinder boxes, filled with dry moss, bark shavings, or charcloth fire drills or bow drills. Friction-based tools, slower but effective, tinder had to be kept dry, even in snowstorms. Sometimes it was wrapped in cloth and stored under layers of clothing to keep it warm enough to catch, and often, fires were never allowed to die out completely. Instead, the coals were banked, covered with ash or turf overnight to smolder safely until morning. This practice meant that in the early morning hours, a family could wake, stir the ash, and with careful breath, bring the fire back to life. A small miracle repeated every day. The hearth, the sacred center. The hearth wasn't just practical, it was sacred. At the center of every longhouse, the fire pit was often aligned with the gods, the ancestors, or ritual tradition. Offerings might be made into the flames, a splash of ale for Thor, a crust of bread for the spirits, herbs burned in silence for protection or guidance. Some believed spirits dwelled near the fire, especially in winter. Children were warned not to speak ill near the hearth. Elders told tales of ghostly visitors who crept in if the fire was allowed to die. And in the dead of night, with only embers glowing, a watcher might stare into the coals and feel as though the past itself were looking back. Fire in the daily rhythm. The fire governed daily life. In the morning, it was revived, the first task of the household midday. It cooked thick stews and boiled water for cleaning. In the evening, it provided heat for drying clothes and warming beds. At night, it was banked, guarded, and revered. Children fell asleep to the hiss of fat in the pan, the creak of logs in the hearth, and the hum of stories spoken beside the flames. Beyond the longhouse, travel and torches. When venturing outside, fire still followed. Vikings carried resin-soaked torches, wrapped in linen lanterns made from horn or thin wood slats coals, carried in pots for restarting fire at the next campfires, were built in stone circles, shielded from wind, carefully managed. In the deep woods, in mountain passes, or along the coast, fire marked the line between man and wilderness. It was their only light, their only heat, their only hope. And so, through bitter winds and endless dark, the Vikings kept their fire alive, not just in their homes, but in their spirits. Because to let the fire go out was to surrender to the night. The day has ended. Outside, the snow has settled. The night air is still. The only sound is the muffled creak of branches under frost and the occasional distant howl of a wolf across the ridge. Inside the longhouse, the final chores are finished. A quietness settles over the space. Not complete silence, but a hush. A slowing. It's time to prepare for sleep. The hearth is banked. Someone, perhaps the eldest son, or a mother, or a grandparent, stirs the fire one last time. A few logs are added. Ash is spread gently over the coals to help them smolder safely through the night. The fire doesn't blaze now. It glows. Its dim, amber light casts long shadows across the benches and beds, the cloaks hanging on the wall, the beams above where herbs sway in the rising warmth. Beds and sleeping arrangements. Viking families didn't have bedrooms. Instead, they slept in the same large space, sharing heat, space, and presence. Along the sides of the longhouse are raised wooden platforms, sometimes with straw bedding, animal hides, or soft woolen blankets laid out. These were the sleeping benches, multi-purpose by day, beds by night. Who slept where? Elders often slept closest to the hearth, where the heat was strongest. Parents might sleep with young children curled together under heavy furs. Older children, apprentices, or unmarried adults found space along the sides or near the livestock partition. Guests or servants might sleep closer to the walls, sometimes with only a thin blanket or spare cloak. It wasn't luxurious, but it was warm, close, and safe. Clothing as blankets before sleep, most Vikings did not undress completely. Instead, they loosened belts, removed outer cloaks, and unwrapped leg bindings. Tunics and underlayers were often kept on, providing insulation through the cold hours. Some might remove boots, drying them by the hearth if damp. Woolen socks or wrapped feet helped preserve warmth. Woolen caps were sometimes worn to bed, especially in the coldest months, preserving precious body heat. Furs were pulled over shoulders. Children were wrapped snugly. Cloaks doubled as blankets. And in the coldest regions, animals, dogs, goats, even sheep, might sleep just feet away, their warmth part of the night. Evening rituals, stories, prayers, and silence. Before sleep, families often shared stories. The sagas of gods and heroes whispered in low voices. Tales of Odin, of Thor's great hammer, of Freya's golden tears, and the wolves that chased the sun. Children would drift off to the sound of their grandparents' voices. Tales told not from books, but memory. Sometimes they prayed, not with folded hands, but with murmured words to the fire, or a silent glance at a carved wooden idol, or the touching of a small charm worn at the neck. A splash of ale might be poured into the hearth. A song, soft, low, half-spoken, might rise into the rafters. These were the rituals of peace, shared before sleep. Quiet moments of connection to ancestors, gods, and each other. The night watch. In larger households, someone often stayed awake, at least for a few hours, to tend the fire, listen for danger, or soothe a restless child. This might rotate, night by night. The watcher would sit close to the hearth, wrapped in furs, poking the coals now and then, perhaps whittling wood, or repairing a tool, or simply listening to the breath of the sleepers, to the wind outside, to the creaking of the beams and the heartbeat of the home, drifting into sleep. Eventually, the watcher too would sleep. The glow of the fire would soften, the last whispers would fade, and the longhouse would fall into quiet. Outside, the dark pressed in, but inside, together, the family lay warm, wrapped in wool and skin, stories, and silence, safe, until morning. Winter in the Viking world wasn't just about cold. It was about darkness, not just the kind that fell over the land, but the kind that crept into the mind, slow, quiet, and heavy. Imagine waking up, and it's still dark, working by the faint light of the fire, and the sun barely rises. Nightfall comes by mid-afternoon, and this pattern repeats for weeks, even months, especially in the far north, where the sun might vanish altogether for stretches of time. The Viking people didn't just survive winter. They survived long, silent battles within. But how? Let's walk into their inner world. They expected the darkness. Unlike us, the Vikings didn't fear winter as something unexpected. They prepared for it all year long, physically and mentally. Every harvest, every firewood pile, every salted fish or woven blanket was more than a task. It was a promise to their future selves. You will make it through the cold. Winter was not a failure. It was a season of honor, of closeness, of stillness, and reflection. They knew it would come. So, they welcomed it. Rituals of the Mind Vikings built strength, not just with muscles, but with rituals that kept their minds sharp and steady. Storytelling preserved their history and distracted from fear. Runes were carved, studied, and sometimes used for meditation, or magical comfort songs were sung softly by firelight. Ballads of gods, heroes, and home prayers were whispered not only to ask for favor, but to stay anchored in their sagas. Even the gods suffered through winter. Even Odin wandered. Even Thor grew weary. To feel tired in winter wasn't shameful. It was natural. But to continue anyway, to press on, to feed your family, to keep the fire alive, that was the Viking way. The strength of silence. Winter offered something rare in the Viking world: quiet. In summer, the days were filled with planting, fishing, mending sails, and preparing for travel. But in winter, the world slowed. There was time for mending clothes, carving wood, or sitting in silence by the hearth. These quiet hours, between sunset and sleep, became sacred. Men reflected. Women wove stories into their craft. Children listened, wide-eyed. Grandparents rested with folded hands. There was no rush, no noise, just presence. And in that stillness, strength grew. The power of community. No one survived winter alone. The Vikings lived in tight, interwoven communities. Families, neighbors, entire villages bound by shared survival. If a family's barn collapsed, others came to help rebuild. If an elder fell ill, they were cared for with herbs, warmth, and attention. Gathering together wasn't just cultural. It was necessary. Shared meals, shared fires, shared stories, shared weight. Everyone had a role, from the youngest to the oldest, and that sense of belonging, of contribution, gave the mind purpose even when the world was frozen. Spiritual perspective, winter as a cycle. The Viking spiritual worldview wasn't one of endless growth, it was cyclical. They believed in seasons, in death and rebirth, in night and day, in the ebb and flow of the gods themselves. Winter was not the end, it was the waiting. And waiting had value. It was during winter that the old gods were honored most. Odin, the wanderer, watching from the shadows. Frigg, the goddess of foresight, keeper of the hearth Skadi, the goddess of winter whose icy strength inspired endurance. The Norse didn't fear Skadi. They respected her. They knew the snow would fall, but also that the thaw would come. Joy in small things. Perhaps the most powerful tool of all, gratitude. Yes, life was hard, but the Vikings took joy in small steady things. A new pair of woolen mittens, a fresh loaf of rye bread, a good laugh at a child's joke, the first spark of fire in the morning. They were not numb. They were attuned. Attuned to survival, yes, but also to beauty. Even in the depths of cold, the mind was afire too. In many ways, the Viking mind was like their hearth, glowing, tended, and quietly alive, even in the deepest night, even when the winds howled, even when the world seemed lifeless. They knew, if we can keep the fire burning within, the cold cannot take us. It's easy to imagine the Vikings as always enduring, fighting storms, bracing winds, pushing through the endless dark. But what's often forgotten is this: the Vikings celebrated winter. They did not fear it. They marked its turning points with feasts, fires, and rituals, gathering their people to lift spirits, share food, and honor gods and ancestors alike. Because in the darkest season, even joy becomes a kind of survival. The heart of celebration, winter as sacred time. Winter was not empty. It was full of stories, songs, memories. It was a time to pause and remember that life, even in stillness, is sacred. As the sun sank lower and days shortened, the Vikings prepared for one of the most important festivals in their calendar, Jol. Jol, the midwinter festival. Long before Christmas reached the northern lands, the Norse celebrated Jol, the ancient festival of the winter solstice. It marked the longest night of the year, the turning point when the sun began its slow return. Jol lasted many days, often 12 or more, filled with ritual, feasting, and symbolic acts that honored gods, ancestors, and the endurance of light in the face of darkness. The roots of today's Yule come from this festival, and so does much of its warmth. Let's walk through the traditions. The Jolblot, midwinter sacrifice. In honor of the gods, and to ensure a bountiful year ahead, the Vikings performed the Jolblot, a winter sacrificial ritual. This did not always mean the sacrifice of animals, though in wealthier homes, a pig or goat might be offered, the meat shared among kin. The ritual was sacred, solemn. The blood of the animal, believed to carry spiritual power, might be sprinkled on statues of gods or on the walls of the longhouse as a blessing. Drinking horns were raised. Toasts were made to Odin for wisdom and protection, Freyr for good harvests, Thor for strength and safe passage through winter, and to departed ancestors whose spirits were honored as living memory. It was a way to look backward and forward. The feast, abundance in a time of scarcity. Despite the cold, the Vikings feasted. This wasn't indulgence for its own sake. It was ritual abundance, a declaration that we are still here, that even in the heart of winter life continues. The longhouse tables were laid with roast meats, carefully salted and preserved from the autumn slaughter, stewed vegetables and onions cooked with herbs, thick barley porridge, rich with butter or honey. Fresh bread, made from the last of the stored grain, and mead or ale, passed from hand to hand in carved drinking horns. There was laughter, music, the clapping of hands, the low thrum of drums or the twang of a lyre. Children danced, elders sang, evergreens and fire, symbols of endurance. During Jol, homes were sometimes decorated with greenery, not for beauty, but as a symbol of life enduring through the cold. Branches of fir, pine, or spruce were brought inside. Fires were lit, large ones. One tradition was the Yule log. A massive log burned slowly over many days, sometimes with sacred runes carved into its surface. As it burned, it symbolized the return of the sun. The wild hunt and spirits of the season Jol was not only joy, it was mystery. The Vikings believed that during midwinter the veil between worlds thinned. Spirits roamed the skies. The wild hunt, led by Odin, was said to sweep across the night, a ghostly procession of the dead and divine. Riders in the sky, dogs that breathed fire, hooves that left no tracks. Children were told to behave. Fires were kept burning. Offerings were left outside for passing spirits. This wasn't fear. It was respect, an acknowledgement that winter wasn't just physical, but spiritual. Games, gifts, and togetherness. Jol was also playful. Vikings played board games like Nafatafel, a kind of Norse chess. They shared small gifts, carved trinkets, food, hand-spun wool, or beads. Even in the depths of cold, there was laughter. There was light, and always there was togetherness. To feast, to laugh, to honor the old gods in the dead of winter. That was how the Vikings survived, not just by shelter or fire, but by gathering around joy when it was hardest to find. The feast is over. The last drinking horn is empty. The longhouse is quiet now. Outside, the snow falls in silence, blanketing the earth in white. Inside, shadows stretch across timbered walls, flickering softly in the dying firelight. This is the Viking night, a room of shadows and warmth. Viking homes were not grand. They were functional, built to preserve heat and keep out the worst of the storm. Inside a typical longhouse, there were few rooms, often just one large space where the family worked, ate, and slept together. At the center, a long hearth stretched down the room, a narrow fire that was never allowed to go out. Beds lined the walls. Some were nothing more than raised wooden platforms. Others had carved headboards and fur-draped coverings. But they were warm, and for the Vikings, they were sacred. The layers of sleep, furs, straw, and wool. To sleep through the long winter night, you needed layers. First, a base of straw or hay, packed tightly and covered with cloth to soften the hardness of the wood. Then, thick woolen blankets, sometimes dyed or embroidered by hand. On top, furs, bear, wolf, reindeer, or sheep, chosen for their warmth and softness, and finally, shared body heat. Families slept close, children curled against parents, elders wrapped tightly beside the hearth. There were no separate rooms, no privacy, but also no isolation. Sleeping together, a communal warmth. In the coldest weeks, warmth was survival. Vikings understood this. Huddling together was not weakness, it was wisdom. Couples, siblings, even neighbors during a storm might share sleeping spaces. Dogs were often welcomed, especially those bred for warmth, like the Spitz-type herding dogs of Scandinavia. They curled at feet or near doorways, keeping cold air at bay. The air might be cold, the wind might howl, but under the furs, pressed close, there was peace. Nighttime rituals, quiet before dreams. Before sleep, there was often ritual, nothing grand, but familiar. Grounding, a quiet prayer to the gods, a whispered blessing for the children, a final tending of the hearth, ensuring the embers would still glow. Come morning, perhaps a story, softly told in the darkness, of Thor's strength, or Odin's wisdom, or Freya's shining hall. The Vikings believed that dreams mattered. They were not just random images, but messages from the spirit world. And so, they entered sleep with reverence, the long winter sleep, stillness as survival. There's evidence that in the far north, where the nights stretched for weeks, some Viking-age peoples practiced a kind of semi-hibernation, sleeping longer, moving slower, letting the body conserve energy. Work was minimized, meals were simple, the pace of life slowed dramatically, and so a winter night might stretch for 12 hours or more, broken only to stoke the fire or drink something warm. The darkness outside was complete, but inside, wrapped in layers, the Vikings rested deeply, letting the season pass around them, letting the body heal and the spirit wander. Dreams of the gods' Vikings often dreamed of their gods and ancestors. In sagas and poems, dreams were treated with serious respect. They might be interpreted in the morning, shared by the fire over breakfast. A dream of a raven could mean a message from Odin. A dream of snow melting might be taken as a sign that spring would come early. Some believed that dreams allowed the soul to travel, walking among the worlds of Norse myth, Midgard, Asgard, even Helheim. In winter, when the veil between worlds was thin, the dreams grew richer. And so, as they drifted to sleep beneath wool and fur, the Vikings entered a world as vast as any fjord. And the fire never went out. Even in their sleep, someone would stir from time to time to feed the hearth. It was quiet work, a log placed gently, a glance to the door, checking for snowdrifts, a sip of warm ale or broth. Then, back under the furs, back to dreaming, back to waiting out the long night. The Viking night was long, but it was not lifeless. It was filled with warmth, dreams, and the slow, sacred rhythm of survival. In the cold heart of winter, the hearth became the center of life, and the Viking women were its keepers. They were not warriors on ships or raiders on foreign shores, but they held a different kind of power, the quiet strength that sustains through storms and darkness. Without them, the long winters would not have been survived, not by any man, nor child, nor elder. Mothers of the fire. The hearth fire was sacred. It was warmth, light, cooking, and protection, all in one. It had to be tended constantly, fed with wood, shielded from drafts, stirred when it grew low, watched even through the night. This was not the job of a servant. This was the work of wisdom. A Viking woman knew how to read fire, when to poke it, when to let it rest, which logs burned long, which smoked too much, which split easily in frost. To care for the fire was to care for life itself. Weavers of warmth. The bitter cold was relentless, clothes wore out, furs grew thin. And so, through the long winters, Viking women worked by firelight, weaving, spinning, sewing, repairing, their hands shaped. Woolen tunics and cloaks, thick enough to keep the chill out. Linen undergarments, cleaned and mended with care. Wool stockings and mittens, sometimes felted for warmth, and fur-lined boots, stitched from leather or reindeer hide. They also dyed fabrics with natural pigments, sometimes deep reds, blues, or yellows, bringing color to the gray days of winter. Every stitch was a gift of survival. Healers and herbalists. In winter, illness was a constant threat. Colds, fevers, infections. Without modern medicine, these could be deadly. Viking women were often the family's healers, passing knowledge from mother to daughter across generations. Their stores held dried herbs gathered in summer, chamomile, yarrow, thyme, resins and salves made from pine sap or beeswax, hot drinks brewed from elderberry, mint, or juniper, and charms, carved runes, or whispered blessings to ward off spirits of sickness. Their medicine was part science, part ritual, part faith. and it kept families alive through the deepest nights. The Spakona, women of prophecy. Not all Viking women stayed at the hearth. Some walked a path of mysticism and magic. These were the Spakonur, female seers and wise women, respected and sometimes feared. They practiced Sedur, a Norse form of magic that involved trance, prophecy, and spirit work. During winter, they were often consulted more than ever. People feared what the darkness might bring. A failed hunt? A bad dream? The coming of wolves or sickness. The Spakona would perform her rites, her eyes covered, staff in hand, sometimes chanting or calling on spirits for guidance. In winter, when the veil between worlds was thin, her voice could reach farther. Storytellers and memory keepers. By firelight, women told the old stories. They passed down sagas, not just of gods and heroes, but of ancestors, kin, and clan. They remembered who married whom, which child was born in which winter. The year the snows came early, the time the wolf was seen at the door. Their stories were maps of the past, holding families together through shared memory. When the wind howled outside, it was their voices that calmed children to sleep. Guardians of the dead winter brought death, and women were often the ones who prepared the bodies, washing them, dressing them, speaking final prayers or blessings. They knew how to mourn with dignity, how to hold space for grief without breaking. They would light a candle. They would close the eyes. They would place a sprig of evergreen, or a drop of mead, or a carved amulet, a final gift for the journey to the other world. Their love did not stop at the edge of life. The quiet power of women in winter. In sagas, we hear of battles and voyages, but the true power of Viking winter was not in the sword. It was in the firelit room, the soft thread pulled through wool, the bowl of hot broth placed in a trembling hand. It was in the eyes of a woman who knew that spring would come, because she had lived through 30 winters before this one, and she would live through this one too. And so, the long winter night passes. The snow outside still falls, soft and steady, like the quiet breathing of the earth itself. But inside, in the minds of those who remember, the fire still burns. The Vikings were not just warriors, not just raiders or explorers. They were survivors of the cold, keepers of warmth, builders of strong homes, weavers of wool and of stories. They faced darkness not with fear, but with ritual, with preparation, and with community. They knew that winter could take everything, but they also knew it could give something too. Time to rest, time to gather close, time to dream. And even now, centuries later, we can feel something of that same rhythm when the nights grow long and the wind begins to howl. A part of us remembers, so if you ever find yourself on a cold night, wrapped in a blanket, listening to the wind beyond the walls, think of them. Think of the Viking family gathered near the hearth, of fur-lined cloaks, of bread shared and fires tended, of gods whispered to in the dark. And know that you too are part of that long chain of winter survivors, stretching all the way back to snow-covered fjords and stars that watched over ancient dreams. Thank you for joining me tonight. Sleep well, and may the fire within you never go out.